Where are you coming from?
Work, the post office. You almost hit me. What's going on?
Let's see some ID.
Why? I haven't done anything wrong.
The heavy steel doors of the United States Postal Service Processing Center in downtown Atlanta slammed shut with a metallic thud that echoed across the empty loading dock. It was 6:15 p.m. on a damp Tuesday in November. The sky had already bruised into a deep, unforgiving purple, and the sodium streetlights flickered to life, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the wet pavement. Marcus Coleman, a 32-year-old mail carrier, rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the familiar, dull ache of a 10-hour shift. He had just spent the day lugging 40 pounds of mail through the freezing rain, and all he wanted was the warmth of his Honda Civic and the leftover lasagna waiting in his fridge. He had swapped his damp, light blue USPS uniform shirt for a thick, dark gray fleece hoodie, though he still wore his regulation postal trousers with the subtle blue stripe down the leg. His leather satchel, now empty of mail but heavy with his personal items, thermal thermos, and a paperback novel, hung securely across his chest. He pulled his hood up against the biting wind and began the 2-block walk to the employee overflow parking lot. He was tired, his guard was down, and he was completely unaware that across the street, idling in an unmarked dark gray Dodge Charger, 2 plainclothes agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement were watching his every move. Inside the suffocatingly warm cabin of the Charger, Agent Miller and Agent Davis were finishing their 14th hour of a targeted surveillance operation. They were part of a fugitive task force searching for a deported felon who had allegedly re-entered the country and was suspected of utilizing a drop house in the industrial district. Their target profile was agonizingly broad. A black male in his 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, last seen wearing dark winter clothing. It was a description that could fit 1,000 men in a 5-mile radius. But fatigue breeds intellectual laziness, and bias often fills the gaps left by exhaustion. As Marcus stepped off the curb, his head down against the wind, his dark hoodie and the bulky satchel caught Miller's eye. Miller tapped the steering wheel, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a federal employee leaving a federal building. He saw a man in a dark hoodie, moving quickly away from an industrial zone, carrying a large bag. He saw a shadow that fit a preconceived notion. Davis, sipping lukewarm coffee, glanced over and nodded. There was no discussion of articulable facts. There was no cross-referencing of photographs. There was only a mutual, unspoken assumption dressed up as professional instinct. Miller put the car in drive, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt as they rolled slowly forward, stalking Marcus from across the street before abruptly cutting the wheel and accelerating, angling the heavy vehicle to block the crosswalk just as Marcus stepped onto it. Marcus stopped short, his heart spiking as the Charger lurched to a halt inches from his knees. The doors flew open before the car was even in park. 2 men in tactical vests over civilian clothes stepped out into the freezing rain. The letters ICE were emblazoned in dull, reflective yellow across their chests, but in the glaring headlights, Marcus barely registered the acronym. He just saw aggression. Miller approached, with his hand resting casually but purposefully on the butt of his holstered sidearm. It was a tactic designed to establish immediate, unquestionable dominance. Davis flanked Marcus, cutting off his path to the sidewalk. Marcus instinctively took a half-step back, his hands rising slightly from his pockets, palms open. He wasn't scared, not yet, but he was profoundly confused. Miller stopped 2 feet away, invading Marcus's personal space. The agent did not introduce himself. He did not state his purpose. He simply looked Marcus up and down, his gaze lingering on the bulky leather satchel. "Where are you coming from?" Miller asked, his voice a flat, authoritative bark that demanded compliance rather than an answer. Marcus frowned, pointing a thumb back over his shoulder toward the massive, block-long brick building he had just exited. "Work, the post office." "Look, you guys almost hit me. What's the problem?" Marcus's voice was steady, but the adrenaline was making his hands tremble slightly. He was a citizen, a veteran, and a federal employee. He believed naively that the truth was a shield. But Davis stepped closer, his flashlight clicking on, the blinding beam hitting Marcus directly in the eyes. "Let's see some ID," Davis commanded, completely ignoring Marcus's question. This is the exact moment where the cinematic tension meets the cold reality of constitutional law. To a casual observer, it looks like standard police work. But beneath the surface, a massive procedural failure was already unfolding. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. For law enforcement to legally detain someone, a brief investigatory stop known as a Terry stop, they must possess what the law calls reasonable suspicion. This cannot be a hunch. It cannot be a gut feeling. It must be based on specific, articulable facts that suggest crime is afoot. Walking while black in a dark hoodie near an industrial park does not meet that legal threshold. The agents had no lawful basis to detain Marcus, and because they had no lawful basis to detain him, they had no lawful basis to demand his identification. Marcus squinted against the blinding light, raising a hand to shield his eyes. "Can you lower the light? I haven't done anything wrong. Why do you need my ID?" he asked. It was a reasonable question, asked by a man who knew he had rights. But to officers accustomed to unquestioned obedience, a citizen asserting their rights is often interpreted as a threat. The shift in the agent's demeanor was instantaneous and chilling. The assumption of guilt crystallized. "We're not asking you, buddy," Miller sneered, his tone dropping an octave, abandoning any pretense of a consensual encounter. "You match the description of a fugitive. Now give me the bag and give me your ID, or we're going to have a very bad night." Marcus felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The absurdity of the situation was entirely eclipsed by the very real danger he was in. "I'm a mail carrier," Marcus stated clearly, emphasizing every word. "My wallet is in my bag, along with my federal badge. If you let me reach in, I will show it to you." He made a slow, deliberate movement toward the flap of his leather satchel. It was a fatal miscalculation of the agent's paranoia. "Don't move your hands! Keep your hands where I can see them," Davis roared, drawing his weapon halfway from the holster. Miller lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder of his fleece and shoving him hard against the slick, wet hood of the Charger. The impact knocked the wind out of Marcus. Before he could process the physical assault, Miller had roughly kicked Marcus's legs apart, while Davis ripped the satchel from his chest. The leather strap caught on Marcus's neck, burning the skin. "I told you my badge is in there!" Marcus yelled, his cheek pressed against the freezing metal of the car, rain mixing with the humiliation stinging his eyes. "Shut up!" Miller hissed, wrenching Marcus's arms behind his back with unnecessary force. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit brutally into Marcus's wrists. The click of the ratchet teeth locking into place sounded deafening in the quiet street. At this juncture, the procedural errors compounded into outright constitutional violations. By placing Marcus in handcuffs and physically restraining him, the encounter had escalated from an unlawful detention into a full custodial arrest. For an arrest to be legal, the standard of proof rises from reasonable suspicion to probable cause. Probable cause requires concrete evidence that a specific crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed by the specific person being arrested. The agents had nothing. They had a broad description, a man in a hoodie, and their own bruised egos because the man dared to ask, why? Furthermore, Davis was now rummaging through Marcus's closed satchel. A search incident to arrest is only valid if the arrest itself is lawful. Because the arrest was fundamentally illegal, tearing through Marcus's personal property without a warrant was a direct violation of his civil rights. Davis pulled out a battered leather wallet, a stainless steel thermos, and a paperback copy of a science fiction novel. He opened the wallet. The beam of his flashlight illuminated a Georgia driver's license. Marcus Coleman, born in Atlanta. Right behind it was a plastic identification card bearing the eagle logo of the United States Postal Service. Davis stared at the cards. He looked at the date of birth. He looked at the name. None of it matched their fugitive. The silence between the two agents stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, masked only by the sound of the idling engine and the falling rain. There was no sudden apology. There was no immediate realization of their profound mistake that led to them uncuffing him on the spot. Instead, human nature and institutional arrogance took over. Admitting fault in the field is a vulnerability these agents were not trained to show. "Put him in the back," Miller said quietly, entirely ignoring the evidence that had just destroyed their entire justification for the stop. "We'll sort it out at the sector." They hauled Marcus upright, his shoulders screaming in pain from the awkward angle of his bound arms, and shoved him into the cramped, cage-like back seat of the Charger. The smell of stale sweat and cheap air freshener made Marcus nauseous. As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the familiar, safe silhouette of the post office behind, Marcus stared out the rain-streaked window. He wasn't thinking about lawsuits or constitutional law. He was thinking about how easily his freedom had been stripped away, how entirely powerless he was in the back of this dark car, and how his lasagna was getting cold. The holding cell of the ICE processing center was a sterile, brightly lit nightmare of concrete and stainless steel. There were no clocks, deliberately disorienting the detainees. Marcus sat on a rigid metal bench, his hands finally uncuffed, rubbing the angry red welts on his wrists. Hours bled into one another. He asked for a phone call. He was ignored. He stated he was a U.S. citizen. He was told to sit down and shut up. He was surrounded by a bureaucratic machine designed to process human beings as administrative problems, not as individuals with rights. Outside the cell, in the fluorescent-lit bullpen, Miller and Davis were struggling to write their incident report. They were trying to reverse engineer probable cause, a common and deeply unethical practice. They wrote that Marcus was loitering in a high-crime area, that he exhibited nervous, evasive behavior upon visual contact, and that his bulky bag suggested the concealment of contraband or weapons. They were building a narrative of suspicion to justify an action born of bias. It wasn't until nearly 2 a.m. that a weary shift supervisor, a 20-year veteran named Hernandez, finally picked up Marcus's file. Hernandez rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the intake photos, then at the photocopies of Marcus's driver's license and postal badge. He read the arresting agent's narrative. The discrepancy was glaring. A federal postal worker leaving his assigned facility at the end of his shift does not constitute evasive behavior. Hernandez called Miller and Davis into his glass-walled office. The conversation was muted through the glass, but Marcus, watching from his cell, could see the supervisor's face turning a mottled red, his hands gesturing sharply toward the file. Hernandez understood instantly what the junior agents had done. They had profiled a black man in a hoodie, violated protocol, bypassed the Fourth Amendment, and kidnapped a United States citizen off the street. The liability was astronomical. 20 minutes later, the heavy metal door to Marcus's cell unlocked. Hernandez stood there, his face completely devoid of emotion. He did not offer an apology. He did not explain what had happened. The institution's primary goal in the face of a colossal failure is self-preservation. Apologies imply guilt, and guilt means lawsuits. "Coleman, you're being released. Come get your property," Hernandez said flatly. Marcus stood up, his joints stiff, his mind a swirl of anger and profound relief. He was handed a manila envelope containing his wallet, his keys, and his badge. His satchel was thrust into his arms. He was escorted out the back door of the facility into the freezing, pre-dawn darkness, miles away from his car, miles away from home. He had to walk 3 blocks to a 24-hour gas station just to call a cab. When he finally walked through his front door as the sun was coming up, he didn't eat. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the red rings on his wrists, and wept. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming, degrading humiliation of being treated like an animal simply for walking down the street. The story could have ended there. For thousands of people who experience unlawful stops and searches, it does end there. The system relies on the exhaustion of its victims. It relies on the assumption that a working-class mail carrier won't have the resources, the time, or the emotional bandwidth to fight the federal government. But the lingering pain in Marcus's shoulders, the sudden panic attacks he experienced every time an unmarked car drove past him on his route, and the deep, burning sense of injustice would not let him rest. 3 weeks later, Marcus walked into the mahogany-paneled office of a high-profile civil rights attorney in downtown Atlanta. He laid his medical records, documenting the nerve damage in his wrists, and a timeline of the events on the glass desk. The attorney, a sharp, meticulous woman named Sarah Jenkins, listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Jenkins leaned forward. She didn't offer him false hope. She explained that suing federal agents is notoriously difficult. She explained the concept of qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that shields government officials from being held personally liable for constitutional violations unless the official violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. "They will argue," Jenkins warned, "that they made a reasonable mistake in the heat of the moment. They will argue that their suspicion, however flawed, was in good faith. Our job is to prove that no reasonable officer in their position could have believed that stopping you, assaulting you, and searching your bag was lawful." Thus began a grueling 4-year legal nightmare. Marcus filed a civil rights lawsuit under what is known as a Bivens action, which allows citizens to sue federal agents for constitutional violations, coupled with claims under the Federal Tort Claims Act for false arrest and assault. The federal government, with its seemingly infinite resources, fought tooth and nail. They filed endless motions to dismiss. They dragged out the discovery process. They tried to bury Jenkins in paperwork. But the discovery phase is where the government's protective wall began to crumble. Jenkins obtained the GPS data from the agent's charger, proving they had been parked nearly 200 yards away when they first spotted Marcus, making their claim of observing nervous behavior physically impossible in the dark. She obtained the radio dispatch logs, showing the agents never called in Marcus's description before making the stop. But the turning point, the truly cinematic climax of the legal battle, occurred during the sworn deposition of Agent Miller. The deposition took place in a sterile conference room. The air was thick with tension. Miller sat across the table, exuding a practiced, arrogant calm flanked by two Department of Justice attorneys. Jenkins methodically walked Miller through his own incident report. She projected the grainy surveillance footage from the post office loading dock onto a screen, showing Marcus exiting the building, tired and slow. "Agent Miller," Jenkins said, her voice a surgical instrument, "in your report, you stated Mr. Coleman matched the description of your fugitive. Can you read that description for the record?" Miller shifted slightly in his chair. "Black male, 30s, approximately 6 feet, dark winter clothing. Mr. Coleman is 5'9", isn't he?" "In the dark, it's hard to gauge exact height," Miller deflected. "And your fugitive, according to your own file, has a prominent 3-inch scar across his left cheek. Did you observe a scar on Mr. Coleman's face before you blocked the crosswalk with your vehicle?" "I couldn't see his face clearly. He had his hood up." Jenkins paused, letting the silence hang. "So, to be clear, Agent Miller, you could not see his face. You could not verify his height. You were 200 yards away. Yet you determined you had reasonable suspicion to execute a stop. What, specifically, was the articulable fact that led you to believe Mr. Coleman was a deported felon?" Miller locked eyes with Jenkins, his arrogant veneer cracking slightly. "It was the totality of the circumstances, his posture, the way he was carrying the bag. It's police instinct. You wouldn't understand." Jenkins didn't smile, but her eyes flashed. "I understand perfectly, Agent Miller. I understand that instinct is the word you use when you don't have probable cause. I understand that your instinct told you a black man with a bag in a dark neighborhood was a criminal, despite him walking out of a federal post office. You didn't stop a suspect, Agent Miller. You profiled a citizen." The DOJ lawyers objected frantically, but the damage was permanently etched into the legal transcript. The deposition exposed the institutional rot. It proved that the agents had acted not on evidence but on unchecked bias, violating the most basic tenets of the Fourth Amendment. They had manufactured their justification after the fact to cover up an illegal arrest. As the trial date approached, the government's defense completely collapsed under the weight of the evidence Jenkins had amassed. Facing a public trial that would brutally expose the systemic failures and racial profiling tactics of their task force, the Department of Justice offered a settlement. It was an admission of defeat wrapped in a non-disclosure agreement. Marcus Coleman, a mail carrier who just wanted to go home and eat lasagna, was awarded $8 million for the violation of his civil rights, false imprisonment, and physical trauma. When Marcus signed the final settlement papers, his hand still trembled slightly, a permanent physical reminder of the handcuffs. The money was life-changing. It secured his family's future, allowed him to retire immediately, and bought him a house in a quiet neighborhood far away from the industrial district. But as he walked out of his lawyer's office and stood on the busy Atlanta sidewalk watching the city move around him, the victory felt deeply hollow. He watched a police cruiser roll slowly past the intersection. He felt the involuntary tightening of his chest, the phantom weight of the handcuffs on his wrists. The $11.8 million had bought him financial security, but it could not buy back his profound sense of safety. It could not erase the memory of being stripped of his dignity and his rights on a dark street corner simply because of how he looked and the assumptions two men made in the dark. The story of Marcus Coleman is not a triumphant tale of instant justice. It is a sobering autopsy of a system that frequently operates on the razor's edge of constitutional violation. It highlights how easily the protective walls of the Fourth Amendment can be torn down by the casual arrogance of authority combined with unconscious bias. It took 4 years of agonizing litigation to prove what Marcus knew. The second he was thrown against the hood of that car, he was innocent, and his rights had been violated. As we look at cases like this, stripped of the dramatic courtroom music and distilled down to the terrifying reality of a man detained simply for walking home, we are left to ponder the true cost of our law enforcement practices. The money came from taxpayers, essentially penalizing the public for the sins of the agents, while the agents themselves moved on, shielded by the very system that failed Marcus. It forces us to ask a difficult, unsettling question about the society we live in. If the constitutional rights designed to protect us can be so easily ignored on a dark, rainy street corner, how much is our freedom actually worth, and who is truly held accountable when it is stolen?